From the nation's capital, this is the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast with your host, Rob Snowhite.
This is episode 200 of the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast. This episode is brought to you by Dry Fly Distilling. This episode features Langdon Cook, who is a writer, instructor, and lecturer on wild foods and the outdoors. Langdon has been nominated for a James Beard Award and a Pushcart Prize. He has been profiled in Bon Appetit, Wall Street Journal Magazine, Whole Living, and Salon.com. His writings appear in numerous magazines, newspapers, and online journals, including Terrain, Gray Sporting Journal, Eating Well, Outside, The Stranger, and Seattle Magazine. His on-screen credits include the PBS TV series Food Forward, the Travel Channel's Trip Flip, and the webcast The Perennial Plate. Upstream is an in-depth and timely look at salmon, one of the last wild foods on our tables. As the author travels to meet a variety of colorful people associated with this unique species, from Alaskan anglers to fish farm owners to four-star chefs, Langdon reports on its remarkable place at the intersection of nature, commerce, cuisine, and human history. For more information on Langdon, visit his website, langdoncook.com, LANGDONCOOK.com. This episode is brought to you by Dry Fly Distilling. Dry Fly Distilling embraces the farm-to-bottle approach and believes it is the consumer's right to know what they are drinking, where it came from, and how it was produced. With no shortcuts, Dry Fly produces spirits from grain to glass. They invest in every step of the process and have a passion for what they do because they believe the right way is the only way. Find their gins, vodkas, and whiskeys at your favorite purveyor of fine spirits. For more information on Dry Fly Distilling, visit their website at dryflydistilling.com. Follow them on social media as well as Langdon Cook. And now, episode 200. All right, we have Langdon Cook with us, and I picked up his book, Upstream, just on a whim at the library. And after reading it, I thought he'd be a great podcast guest. And also, I don't know what the term is when you finish a book you really like. It's sort of like a depression or a hangover. Then I'm like, damn it, I finished this book and I really enjoyed it. So I guess I'm going to have to pick up your other book.
That's what we like to hear.
Yeah. All right, so let's learn about yourself before we get into your writing career. Where did you grow up?
Sure. I'm a New Englander. I spent time in Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Vermont before moving out west. I can't remember exactly when I first picked up a fly rod, but I remember distinctly going on my first fly fishing trip. I wasn't actually fishing. I was with a friend, and his dad was fishing. We went to Pennsylvania. I was probably 10, and me and my friend spent most of the time, crawling around in the stream, catching frogs, that sort of thing, while his dad was fishing. And, I had this conception back then, which I love, and in a way, I kind of wish it was still like this, but I thought that basically fly fishing was all about the false cast, and you just false casted all day, hoping to get the fish, to launch from its watery environment into the air to take the fly midair. I thought that's what it was all about for many years until I finally tried it myself.
And then you started getting lines tangled, and you're like, what did I get myself into?
Yeah, the bird's nest. No, I probably first picked up a fly rod in Wyoming. I worked on a ranch, a guest ranch. I guess it was the summer after my sophomore year in college. I was probably 19, and we would take the dudes, the guests, up into the hills on these trail rides. And I don't think I'd ever even ridden a horse before, but they took pity on me, I guess, and gave me the job, and it was wonderful. I just wanted to be outside in the mountains, and there was another wrangler, as we called ourselves there, who was old hand at fly fishing, and he would take us up outside of, we were along the Snake in Jackson Hole. And, of course, the guests would all fish the Snake, but we weren't allowed to. So we had to go find these small streams in the National Forest, and we'd hop in his pickup and take these old logging roads. And I can remember coming to a fork in the road, and there was a sign that said, "You are now entering grizzly country." And he said, "This is the spot." And to this day, that stream kind of remains, at least in my mind's eye, the template of the perfect trout stream, and that is where I first caught my very unsophisticated cutthroat trout.
Do you remember what you caught it on?
I think a humpy, a yellow humpy, which was perfect. Something
nice classic pattern.
Yeah, something that had a lot of float to it. And I had my fair share of birds' nests, that's for sure, getting tangled up in the willows behind me. But it was just a beautiful purling stream that came out of the mountains, and never saw any grizzlies, but maybe that kept others away because I never saw another angler, as a matter of fact. And we would go up there evenings after our last trail rides of the day, and it was the perfect place to learn. And I was immediately caught up in all the trappings of it. I loved the rods and the reels and the lines and the flies, and going into town and just sort of looking over all the different flies and what I might try. And, I had a few in my box. I probably had, parachute Adams and some humpies and some elk hair caddis, basic dry flies. No nymphing. You didn't need to. These were not very smart fish. They were very willing, which was perfect for me. And some of them could actually get sizable, despite the, this was a small stream, but we had a buddy with us who was spin casting, and he would always catch the biggest fish, but he would catch 19, 20 inchers, and we would take him back to the ranch cook, who was this Cajun from New Orleans. I don't know how he ended up in Jackson Hole, but he would make us these wonderful trout breakfasts with our catch.
Catching a big cutthroat like that on spin gears, to me, is like non-alcoholic beer. It's out there, but it doesn't do it for me.
I know, we kept trying to bring him over to our side, but he was happy, and that's where it began for me. Over the next few years, I kind of learned a little more, and then next thing you know, you're buying gear and driving all over creation looking for new streams, and that's that. You're you're deep into it.
Absolutely. So that was 3/4 across the country. What got you all the way out to the West Coast?
That's right. So I still had to go finish up college in Vermont. And then as soon as I graduated, I think the next day, I made tracks for the West Coast. I had been steadily making my way west during summers, summer jobs. And so when I was finally done with my schooling, I just knew I wanted to be west of the 100th meridian. And so hopped in my car with a friend, drove as far as we could until we broke down, which happened to be in Taos, New Mexico, and got jobs at the ski mountain the next day. And if the timing of this seems odd, I graduated from college in Vermont at the very beginning of February, because I started mid-year and I finished mid-year, and I actually skied down our little local mountain to get my diploma, and then the next day was off heading for the west. And so we got jobs at Taos on the mountain and spent the rest of the ski season there, and then continued our push and ended up in California that spring, where I got actually my first newspaper job.
All right. Did you study literature or writing in college? Did you plan on being a writer?
Well, I was an English major and with a focus on creative writing, and I think my senior thesis was a collection of stories. So really fiction was my first love. But I kind of approached it in the old school way of becoming a cub reporter and getting that newspaper experience, which I did both in San Francisco and Berkeley. And I had done some newspaper work in college as well. but started just, writing kind of local beat stories,
Anything really strange? I read today that some lady called 911 because her pet raccoon was stoned and was going crazy. And I'm just thinking, the person writing that must have been like, I was not expecting this when I woke up today.
Yeah, I had to do the police blotter for a while, and talk about good material to put away for the novel later.
I think that's where Carl Hyacin gets it all from.
Totally, and in fact, I did work on a couple of novels, and thankfully they've stayed in the proverbial desk drawer. But it would be a number of years later when I would realize that you could open up the novelist's tool bag and use all those tools to write nonfiction. But that would be many years later, really a whole new life later, because I had to do a lot of things in between before I got to that point.
Were there any literary influences, past or present? Any favorite books you've read multiple times?
On the fishing side of things, I've always loved the angling writing of Tom McGuane and Jim Harrison and people like that. I mean, McGuane is such a great stylist. I just love reading his sentences. He has a way of really waking you up and just turning a phrase that, is odd and beautiful at the same time, and conveys.
He's got quite the vocabulary, too. I'll put down a book and have to look up the word or ask my wife if she's in the same room.
Yeah, he does. And he just, there's a little bit of that sort of impish kind of wit there, a little bit of the, the sort of a 60s kind of, way of maybe tweaking the establishment a bit. Certainly, I love those guys. I really like the writing of Bill Barrick. Have you ever read him?
Not familiar.
So he has a book about horse racing, actually, called "Laughing in the Hills." It's nonfiction, and he is also a wonderful stylist. He writes about fly fishing quite a bit too, and these pieces end up in some of his collected nonfiction works, and you can find them out there. He wrote for the New Yorker for many years, but a wonderful stylist, and his stuff on fishing is really great. I think a few of his personal essays I've just taken out and, completely diagrammed them to see just how he pulled off the magic, which I've done with some other writers. I highly recommend diagramming, an essay or a short story to figure out how the writer put it together, because as you take it apart and put it back together, you really figure out kind of the nuts and the bolts of the craft. And I have a few of his pieces that I've completely marked up with all sorts of notations and arrows and, flashback here and flash forward there and, which character is suddenly introduced and new concepts. And it's a great way to kind of to figure out the craft.
And when you were doing the beat writing, were you also writing for non-work? Coming home and jotting stuff down, writing stories?
Yeah, so I didn't really finish my trajectory. So I lived in the Bay Area for a couple of years, where I got kind of my first newspaper experience. And then I moved up to Seattle to go to the University of Washington's writing program. As I'd mentioned, I'd sort of been working on a couple of novels, and I really wanted to write fiction. And so that's what I concentrated on for a couple of years. But, the internet happened while I was here. And so I just, got caught up in that. And the next thing you know, I was doing some editorial work over at Microsoft. And that led to a job at the fledgling Amazon.com, which most people hadn't heard of at that point.
Just a bookstore. In fact, our neighbors, they moved last summer. When they got married, their first landlord to help make extra money in Seattle was Jeff Bezos. They rented a one-bedroom from him.
Come on.
That's how he was making side money at the time.
Amazing. Well, I guess I first met him in the spring of '97, and that's when I signed on over there as an editor. My first job there was, and I don't know how old you are and if you remember some of those early days with the Amazon website, but back in the beginning, there would just be one book on the homepage. And so, the editorial group would get together every day and decide what book that was going to be. And it was my job to do the sort of web production work to put that book on the front page, on the homepage.
And that was all writing code back in the day for HTML.
Yeah. I mean, I just knew some basic HTML, and then we were Unix based. So I had to learn a little bit of Unix. And so that was, I was the one that was putting that book up on the homepage every day as my first job with Amazon. But then, of course, as everyone knows, the company quickly grew very large. And the next thing you know, there was music and then DVDs and so on. But I ended up spending several years working there. And then in, I guess, the spring of 2004, my wife, Martha Solano, who is a poet, and she teaches at Bellevue College here in the Seattle area. It's just across the lake in Bellevue. She received a writing residency, which we just couldn't pass up. I had to quit my job. She took a sabbatical from her work, and we parachuted into the wilderness of southwestern Oregon in the Rogue River Canyon. And we were caretakers of a cabin, a homestead, that had been grandfathered into the wild and scenic river corridor of the Rogue. So we were basically in a roadless area, 2 hours from the nearest town, and taking care of this homestead with nothing to do but, fish the Rogue and write about it. And we had a 3-year-old at that point, so we brought our boy Riley into the woods with us. And as things happen, we ended up leaving just under a year later, left the woods with a new kid, our daughter Ruby. So
there was other things to do besides write and fish.
Exactly. Went in with one, came out with two, which sometimes happens in the woods. That was the point when I started writing nonfiction. And at first, I was just really writing about what we were doing out there in the woods. We had a huge garden. There was an orchard on the property. We were fishing for salmon and steelhead in the Rogue. We were dealing with the bears every day. There were cougars around. It was just an incredible place to be. And so I just started writing about it. And that would really lead to my first book, Fat of the Land, which is a collection of personal essays about wild foods and foraging. We were doing a lot of foraging on the property. We're hunting mushrooms, and as I mentioned, we were fishing for salmon and steelhead, and there were all sorts of wild greens and huckleberries and things like that. And I'd always done that sort of stuff because I've been a long time hiker and backpacker, and so I was familiar with the world of foraging, but I'd never really written about it before. And I quickly realized that these wild foods are characters in their own right. And the people who harvest them are really interesting. And so I just had all this material to write about. I realized that I could kind of use the same bag of tricks that a novelist uses in writing fiction and just do it with all this stuff that was happening to us off the grid at the homestead. And so that's really where it started for me with the book writing.
That's sort of where you found your voice?
Exactly. That is where I found my voice. And, it took time to hone that, and I feel like it's still kind of shifting. The first book is very personal. I would say there's probably a little more humor in it. I would move into more sort of journalistic realms after that. But still with this kind of first-person approach, nothing is as told to. I mean, I'm out there with the characters that I'm portraying, experiencing what they're experiencing. I wouldn't even know how to really describe my voice. I'm not. What would you say?
Your voice? I'd have to think about that one, but it just clicked with me. I read your book extremely fast. And it was as if I was there following along, riding shotgun and just witnessing everything.
I try to weave together a lot of strands that interest me. So the natural world, food, wildlife, environmental politics, outdoor adventure, all these different threads I try to weave together. But I try to do it in a way that's entertaining without getting too much on my soapbox. I do have a point of view, and I try and get that across in my books, and I'm very, interested in conservation issues. There's been a lot of studies on this, and you just can't win people over by preaching to them. But if you tell them a good story, you might get them to linger for a little while longer. And if they linger, well, maybe they'll start to maybe see things the way you see them. So, I've always sort of seen it as, for dog owners who have to give their dogs, some medicine, the old dog pill wrapped in hamburger trick, right? That's kind of how I see my writing a little bit. I try and entertain with the hamburger piece, even if sometimes there is that bitter pill that needs to be swallowed.
And all those points you just mentioned are all things that I'm interested in, would seek out in reading or like a podcast or a radio, like an NPR story. So I was drawn to it. And I don't really think there's any bad pill in there, for me at least, because I agree with everything that you write. Otherwise, I would still invite someone on that I didn't agree with, but everything in that book clicked with me. And I liked how you jump back, different location to location, from a person you were traveling with, from TU to Cal Trout, and then you basically just went up and down the coast. It was an adventure for me.
Well, that's great to hear. And, maybe we're birds of a feather. For a lot of people, some of these issues, they're hard to hear. They want to do things as they've always been done. We get handed down these mythologies that we live by, and we do things because, well, that's the way our parents did it, and that's the way their parents did it. And, why shouldn't I be able to continue this behavior? I think one of the subtexts of all my books is that we have to change our relationship to the natural world. If we want to hand over to the next generation some of these things that you and I both love, whether they're wild rivers and wild trout, the mountains, open spaces, clean air, clean water. I mean, these are values that do not have price tags attached to them. And in order to have them for the future, we're going to have to change our relationship to nature. I think that's kind of the bottom line.
Absolutely. So Upstream, and I go to the library, it's the 600 section, science novels and stuff, and I stay away from stuff that I don't get, like the cosmos, and I don't want to read cell biology, and I'd see Upstream, water to the table, salmon. I'm like, well, I'm fascinated by salmon. I'm going to pick this one up. How did it go from me picking up a book at the local library and you getting the idea to write it? Where did this all come from?
Right. Well, so I've been writing about wild foods for the last 10 years. And after Fat of the Land, which was, very personal collection of essays about wild foods and foraging, I turned my sights on the mushroom culture here in the Pacific Northwest, which is just fascinating to me. And in fact, it's the largest all-cash business in North America that's legal. Right. And so I started following mushroom, the guys who do it for a living, the pros.
Did they blindfold you?
You hear those stories. It's the recreational mushroom hunters that are the most secretive. The guys who are doing it for a living, they have so many patches that it just doesn't matter. And the other thing that I learned was that most of the time, their patches are nowhere near the patches that the recreational hunters go to. The recreational hunters, they want to go to a beautiful place. They want to see a nice view. They want to walk on a nice trail. They don't want they don't want the topography to be too rough, et cetera. The professionals are going to gnarly places. They're going to these dog hair forests that, they're mostly timberlands where logging companies are working and the terrain is rough. And we're talking second, third, fourth growth forest, that's really almost industrial forest. It is industrial forest, but those forests are where the mushrooms really grow. So there are famous picking grounds where the professionals and the recreationals sometimes, come into conflict. And I could think of like maybe Central Oregon where matsutake is harvested, or on some of the on the coasts, the coastal beaches where both matsutake and porcini are harvested. Some of these places are known to both the pros and the recreational hunters. But for the most part, the pros are going to these really sort of out-of-the-way forests where you would never see a recreational hunter. And I spent a few years traveling around with these guys, making camp in the woods with them, and really following the pipeline from the picker to the buyer to the restaurant chef. And so, and that was a great writing experience. I felt like that book just kind of wrote itself. I would come back after a few days of being in the woods with these incredible characters, and they really, they had very colorful lives, and just wonderful things to say. They were great to be around. And I would come back and sit down. I think I wrote most of that book at the dining room table. I would just sit down at the table and, chapters just kind of, unfurled for me. It was a wonderful writing experience. And so when that was done, I thought, okay, what am I going to follow that up with? And it just seemed like salmon was kind of the natural extension. Really, when you think about it, wild salmon are the ultimate wild food in North America. Entire societies have been organized around the life cycle of the salmon. Human beings have relied on salmon in North America since first crossing over the Bering Strait maybe 15,000 years ago. There are sites along the Columbia River, they're fishing sites that represent the longest continual human habitation in North America. So for all these reasons, it just seemed like, if I was going to continue to write about wild foods, why not tackle kind of the elephant in the corner, the biggie, and that was wild salmon. And of course, being a fly fisherman myself and an angler in general and a salmon lover and living right in the middle of salmon country, it just made sense. But it was daunting because I knew that, unlike the mushroom world, which essentially is totally hidden from view, and I was shining a spotlight on it. And for many people, this would be their first experience of really even realizing that this whole mushroom business was happening around them. But with salmon, it's a totally different story. Of course, everyone has a dog in this fight. You have all these different user groups who you would think would try to be on the same page because they all want to have salmon around for the future, and yet they can't agree. So I'm talking about, commercial fishermen, tribal fishermen, sport fishermen, conservationists, all these different groups who cherish salmon, and yet, they really are often at loggerheads as well. So I knew that I was kind of wading into some tricky currents, but I guess I felt like, I needed to take the plunge because salmon are up against the ropes right now. Are we going to have this resource for future generations? That's really sort of the question behind the book. And so I went in search of good characters because that's ultimately how I tell my stories. It's through the other characters. And I ran into just some amazing people. And for instance, you mentioned Trout Unlimited. So there's Renee Henry, who is the lead California scientist for Trout Unlimited. And then there's Riley Starks, the reef netter from Lummi Island in Washington State, and so many others. And I really kind of let them tell their own stories. It's a book about salmon culture. And so I try and get into some of the history there, especially with the tribal fishing. But I also try to maybe shine a light on where this culture is headed in the future and what the obstacles are to restoring salmon runs.
Do you think that salmon evolved, and you mentioned in the book that all the catastrophic geological things that were happening for millions of years. When the humans are gone, do you think that our damage could be considered, I guess it is a man-made factor, like the volcanoes erupting and different things that salmon have had to evolve around, and that when we're gone, they may be able to just come back completely, or they might be able to evolve around human destruction. That makes sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, salmon are incredibly resilient. That's the thing. If we give them a little bit of room, I mean, look at the Elwha, for instance, and I'll just give a little bit of background on that for your listeners who are not familiar. So the Elwha dam removal in Washington State is the biggest dam removal in the U.S. to date. And there were 2 dams on the Elwha that were built, essentially illegally because the state charter of Washington basically dictated that you couldn't erect a dam unless there was fish passage. And so the way they got around it, and we're talking 100 years ago, I think the dams were erected in the early 1900s. And so the way they got around that was by building what they called a mitigation hatchery. And that kind of began the process of doing something harmful to a river or to a salmon run and just building a hatchery as the replacement. So, we're going to irrigate this river to death. Okay, we'll build a hatchery. Or we're gonna build a big open pit mine over here. Okay, we'll build a hatchery. We're gonna put up a bunch of dams. We'll build a hatchery. So this process of building mitigation hatcheries to cover the damage of whatever we were doing to the environment started and really continued for the next century, right? Well, finally, I mean, removing the Elwha dams was really a sort of holy grail for fish conservationists. And when it finally happened, I mean, immediately the fish responded. And they're moving up through the system now. And it's an incredible science experiment that's happening right before our eyes. And it's really exciting for people who, love these fish and want to sort of, continue this process of restoring them to other watersheds. But I should mention, the whole idea of restoration is a concept that kind of comes up in the book, especially with one particular character, that of Renee Henry, the fisheries ecologist from Trout Unlimited. And he uses a different term. He uses the term reconciliation. Because as he says, when we think about restoration, we think of it almost as like, an old rusted classic, 65 Mustang that's waiting under a tarp for a new owner with deep pockets who can, do the restoration. But that's not going to happen. The environment is not a rusted out 65 Mustang. The best that we can hope for is more like this reconciliation that he talks about. And I love that word because it kind of evokes long simmering family feuds, and like, for instance, the lower Sacramento River, where he's doing a lot of his work. Like, we're never going to restore that. That's in the breadbasket of the country. The lower Sac is completely channelized and diked, and higher in the watershed you have all the dams. And I mean, it's not going to be restored the way we think of the term restoration. But we can reconcile our sort of man-made, uses of that watershed with kind of renewed natural productivity. So we can, and I write about this in the book in a chapter called The Floodplain Fatties, in which one of the projects that Renee Henry and another colleague of his, Jacob Katz from Cal Trout, the Nigiri project that they're working on.
I'm hoping to have him on as well. We've been emailing. Because from reading your book, I was like, I've got to have him on to talk about the Nigiri project.
Yeah, the Nigiri project's been getting a lot of ink, and well, it should, because it really, as Jacob would say, what he's doing is he's jump-starting sort of the natural engines of productivity in, a very altered landscape. I mean, the Sacramento has been, we've completely changed it, but it can still nurture salmon if we give it a chance. So in the case of the Nigiri project, what they're doing is they're working with the rice farmers, and basically they're breaching some of the dikes, which, that's a word that farmers never want to hear, right? Breach. But they're allowing young salmon out into the rice paddies to forage, and they're finding that the salmon are growing at much faster rates than the fish, the young fish that are stuck back in the deep, swift, cold, channelized river, right? And so when it's finally time to go out to the ocean, they're stronger, they're ready to face predators, they do better, they come back in larger numbers. So that's the sort of project where, you're not going to get rid of all the rice farming that's going on in the lower Sacramento. But if you can work with those farmers to come up with some compromises, there's a word, right, compromise, that it just seems like, is that even in the dictionary any longer? I mean, especially on Capitol Hill, where you live, right? Does anybody know what the word compromise means?
That doesn't happen.
I know. And so, these are the sort of issues that I get into in the book. It's tricky. I mean, we're living right now in just these times where everyone is in their silos, right? But you meet a guy like Rene Henry, and he's reaching out. He's trying to work with ranchers and farmers, and come to some sort of mutual understanding, some sort of compromise, so that we can still have our highly managed landscape in California, where it's probably more managed than anywhere on Earth, right? But also have salmon. I mean, California had epic salmon runs.
Describing just the animals that used to live in the Central Valley there, similar to the Serengeti.
Exactly.
I had no idea.
Yeah. No, it was just an incredible place. That's just, one of the sort of many elements that I get into in the book. I looked for good stories that I could tell. There's way too many. And so I just had to, ultimately it kind of came down to the stories and the characters behind them. There were so many more stories that I could tell. But as it is, there is a lot of jumping around. We moved from Alaska to California to Idaho and points in between. So, it covers a vast geographical area because salmon country is huge, frankly, and a lot of issues as well. The Snake River dams, overfishing on the Skeena system, the list goes on. So I tried to touch on a number of the different issues, logging on the Oregon coast. So there are a lot of different issues that are kind of paired with the people who are working on those issues.
And with all of this driving, did you drive everywhere?
So I flew to Alaska, spent time in Cordova, which is where the famous Copper River salmon originate.
And that's always big. There's a restaurant group here at Clyde's, and that's the big thing every year is the Copper River salmon have come in.
I've been to Clyde's. That's right there in near Georgetown, right?
Yep, that's where the song Afternoon Delight was written.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, John Denver.
Yeah, you got me there. You got me. I flew up to Cordova a number of times and hung out with gill netters up there. And now that's a place that I'm just continuing to go back to. Just beautiful country, great fishing, and I love going and visiting the gill netters up there. All the way down to California. I did do an epic drive. Rene Henry joined me for this. The fisheries ecologist from California. We drove from Astoria, Oregon, all the way to Redfish Lake in Idaho, in central Idaho, following the 900-mile migration of the Chinook and Sockeye that make that longest salmon migration in the lower 48. That's in the chapter about Lonesome Larry, who was the sole sockeye salmon to make it back to Redfish Lake in 1992. And for his diligence was, clubbed over the head and relieved of all his milt so that a huge sort of brood stock hatchery effort could could try and keep that run on life support.
Did you see the Goonies house when you were in Astoria?
The Goonies. No, I didn't see the Goonies house. I did go to this old bough picker. It was called the Bough Picker Restaurant. It was built from an old bough picker fishing boat.
I'm not familiar what a bough picker is.
So a lot of the gill netters, they use what are called bow pickers, and you're picking your net from the front of the boat. That's why they're called bow pickers.
Okay.
And I think they were developed. I think that style of boat was first developed on the Columbia. And so you can go to this restaurant, which has been sort of reclaimed from an old bow picker, and get your fish and chips fix. But of course, when we were there, the fish of the day wasn't salmon; it was tuna, which I thought was very interesting. And part of that, is climate change. With the warming Pacific, the commercial fleet is finding that they can do pretty well with albacore tuna.
That they're moving farther north now.
Exactly.
That's so strange. I swear we're gonna have tarpon in D.C. in a couple of years when the waters get warm enough.
I just caught my first tarpon the other day.
Nice.
Yes. It was, I don't know, we guesstimated it about 80 pounds and brought it to the side of the boat, which I think is good enough, right?
Absolutely.
We tried to kind of get a pick. It had other plans and eventually broke off, but we did bring it to the side of the boat. So I think that one counts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I haven't mentioned this before. I don't eat fish.
You don't?
At all. I like oysters. But
Okay.
after reading your book, I was telling my wife, I was like, I think I might try some salmon now. And she's like, what you talking about, Willis? I said, the reef netting method of a spring run king sounds like that's something I want to try.
The reef net fish are so delicious. And I mean, Riley Starks, one of the characters in the book, who is the marketing director for Lummi Island Wild, which is a cooperative of reef netters on Lummi Island in Washington State. He will tell you that, the tastiest fish in the world are the reef net fish because of the way they're caught. And I spent a lot of time with the reef netters up on Lummi, helping them, as they say, grab web, which is hauling the net in. And it's a little bit difficult to explain, but basically the net is suspended between two barges that are anchored out in Puget Sound, sort of in the migratory path of salmon that are heading for the Fraser River, just over the border in Canada. And they enter what's called the reef. And the reef is like a giant funnel. Traditionally, historically, Native American tribes would have constructed the reef out of beach grass and nettle cordage and that sort of thing. And it'd be, say, 200 feet long and maybe 200 feet wide at the mouth. And basically it would just hang there in the water where the salmon are migrating. And as they migrate as they move into the reef, they see the reef as essentially shoals. And so they're, keeping their distance, but the reef is narrowing, and it's bringing them up in the water column as well. And so by the time they get to the barges, they're sort of, these schools of salmon are all bunched up and into a much more tightly confined space. And at that point, there's a spotter who's standing maybe 20 feet up in this spotting tower, and he can see the school, and he gives the signal to the reef netters with the net when to haul it up. And so when the guy,
sorry to interrupt, the guy in the book, was he the older gentleman that was in the 70s that was the spotter?
Well, right. So, I mean, there are some reef netters. There are old timers out there on Lummi Island who have been doing this for, 60, 70 years. And sometimes they'll just, they'll come out for old time's sake, just to stand in the spotter's, tower and make the call. And it was just an amazing experience to hang out with all these reef netters because they really believe in what they're doing. Now, the great thing about, not only does the reef netting method produce a great piece of fish, because just to finish what I was explaining, when the fish are brought in, they kind of slide down the net. It's almost like a sort of a trampoline. They come sort of bouncing and sliding down the net into waiting holding tanks that are on board the barges. So they're still alive. They're swimming around in the holding tanks, and they swim off the lactic acid buildup from the trauma of their catch. And then at that point, they're gilled by the reef netters and moved to a bleed tank where they just bleed out. As Riley Stark says, they peacefully cross over, and then from there, they're moved to ice totes and rushed to market.
Just sounds like the most ethical, environmental. It sounds like the way that fishing should be done.
It's the only way on the high seas to selectively fish. If you're trolling or you're gill netting or you're purse seining, you can't be selective. And I would see this time after time. A big catch would come in, and there'd be a few fish that didn't look like the others, right? Maybe there'd be, several dozen sockeye salmon headed for the Fraser River, and then half a dozen bigger fish with big black spots on their back, and then a big, fleshy adipose fin. Well, these were wild Puget Sound Chinook, which are ESA listed, and they could just, let the Chinook swim around in the live tank, and then when it was time, once they were healthy and strong again, just sort of, cradle them over the side and off they go, toward their spawning grounds. With the reef netting, that's really the only method where you can do that. A fish that's been caught in a gill net or in a purse seine or on a hook and line, you really can't successfully resuscitate that fish. It's a dead fish. With the reef netting, if they get an ESA protected fish, they can revive it and off it goes. But yeah, it was an amazing thing to watch, and they were true believers, that's for sure. I mean, it's not the money, believe me.
It sounds like a hard work, but it's honest living. Exactly.
And, these are the sort of hard choices that we're going to have to be making. On the Columbia, they're experimenting with some new methods that are more selective. You may have heard of the pound nets that the Wild Fish Conservancy is experimenting with on the Columbia. Because at this point, spring Chinook, that run is just really in trouble. And gill nets don't differentiate between the hatchery fish and the wild fish. So we're going to have to start, changing things up a little bit, experimenting with new possibilities. And, that's why talking with someone like Renee Henry, who has such a big role in the book, is just so much fun for me, because here's a guy, who's a fisheries ecologist, who's seen, all these declines in the fish runs firsthand, and yet is still optimistic because he really believes that there are solutions out there. And it's a matter of people joining together to protect this resource. People realizing that, where we live and how we live is really important. And his optimism was just contagious. And so, it gives me hope that there are people like Renee Henry and Riley Starks out there who are trying to do things differently, and showing others that it can be done. And that's just what's going to have to happen.
And it's a shame that if someone like a Kardashian gets all this money for doing something stupid and vapid and irrelevant, yet there are people busting their humps to basically save an entire species for everybody. And there's such a dichotomy in this world that those guys are making a hard-earned living, and they don't really get the
they get no glory. They barely make a living. And but they're committed, and that's what we need. We need people who are committed, and so yeah, we'll let the Kardashians of the world go along their merry way, right?
Yes, hopefully off a cliff or something. Put them in front of a long line net with some dollar bills on the hooks.
There you go.
What did you eat on the road? There's a lot of frozen gas station burritos when you're doing all this research?
Well, not always. And I'm just not a big fan of.
And I guess as a forager,
you'd be surprised.
Food.
You can find good food just about anywhere. When I was in Cordova, for instance, hanging out with the gill netters up there, oh my God, we ate so well. They took me out mushroom hunting. I discovered a new type of berry called the Nagoon berry. Have you ever heard of a Nagoon berry?
No, but the first time I heard of a Marionberry, I thought it was a joke because that was the old mayor in D.C.,
Yeah.
the crack smoker.
Yeah. Yes,
and my dad brought home Marionberry jam, and we're like, are you kidding us?
Yeah, what's in this? Yeah, exactly.
So what was the name of that berry again?
The Nagoon berry is actually, it would be a relative of the Marionberry. It's in the rubus genus, which is all the blackberries and raspberries, and it's a ground hugger. You find it pretty close to the ground. It looks a little bit like a blackberry, although I guess it's a little sort of more ruby red colored, and it just, despite the fact that it's in these sort of tundra-like conditions up in Alaska, it has this kind of tropical flavor to it. It's just wonderful. And I also picked, I think, high bush cranberries with some of the gill netters, and we went out mushroom picking. We were picking hedgehogs and yellowfoot, and we made incredible feasts. And of course, they would have their home pack that they would bust out of the freezer. So we were eating halibut and salmon and Dungeness crab, spot shrimp, and then mixing in, the fresh mushrooms that we were finding right out the back door and the berries. And I think one of the gill netters made a wonderful cranberry barbecue sauce. I mean, it was just incredible. And then I had lunch at this woman's house. Her husband was a gill netter, and she made meatballs from bear and moose that were just unbelievable with some cranberry ketchup. I mean,
sounds good.
Yeah, and so, Cordova's a town of, 2,000 people. There's no road famously there, and, the bumper stickers you see around town say no road because every now and then there's a push to maybe connect them to the Alaskan road system, but I think there are a lot of people there who would prefer just to keep their isolated, stance. And so you either fly in or take a boat, but man, you eat very well there. And where else? Trying to remember some of the meals that I had on the road. I definitely logged a lot of miles. That trip following, Lonesome Larry's journey, 900 miles up the Columbia. So that, we followed the Columbia to the Snake, and then the Snake to the Salmon River in Idaho, and then finally to to Redfish Lake Creek and Redfish Lake itself. But I think we camped a few nights when we were in the Sawtooth Mountains there, and I like my camp food. When I go camping, it's not freeze-dried astronaut, backpacker food. I mean, I like to whoop up a pretty good camp meal. So, I ate pretty well during the writing of this book. I will say that I found it to be a harder book to write than my previous books. There were a lot of stories to tell, a lot of locations, a lot of settings, a lot of characters, and I had to figure out a way to kind of to work them all together in a narrative way that made sense for the reader. And so ultimately what I realized was that I had to step into the narrative a little more than, I might have been comfortable with. I had to kind of get into the story to a certain degree because I wanted it to ultimately unfold for the reader the way it had unfolded for me. Because what I realized as I was kind of reporting and writing this book was just how complex and complicated these issues are. And so I went from a place of kind of relative naivete to kind of learning just how difficult the whole, the process of getting all these different user groups together to try and take a shared responsibility for this resource that they all love, whether it's the tribal and commercial fishermen or the recreational anglers and the guides, the chefs and restaurant owners, environmentalists, conservationists, all these different people, they love salmon, but they have very different ideas about what to do and how, where these fish will be in the future. And so as I got deeper into it, I felt that I'd sort of developed more of an understanding. And so I wanted to take the reader on that same kind of journey, starting at a place of maybe the most basic understanding. That's why the book starts at Pike Place Market in Seattle with the arrival of the first Copper River salmon of the year. Because at the marketplace, that's where, we have our kind of most basic connection to these fish. Some of us are anglers, some of us, maybe work with these fish in one way or another, but for the average person, it's just as a consumer. It's as somebody who goes to the marketplace to buy a cut of fish. And if you go to Pike Place Market in mid-May, when the first Copper River salmon have arrived, you will see all these tourists and locals who are gathered around these
Starbucks.
You will see them gathered around these big displays of fish, and it's just, these silver-sided fish that are stacked on beds of ice like treasure. And their eyes are popping out of their heads because it's almost in our DNA. Human beings in North America have been eating these fish and husbanding the runs since they first got here, and it's almost like it's in our DNA. And people's eyes are popping out of their heads, and they just, all these salmon. I mean, it's a great scene to see. And so that's why I start the book right there with our sort of our most basic connection to these fish, which is just as consumers, and then you start to get into the issues. Is this a wild fish? Is this a farmed fish? If it's a wild fish, is it a hatchery fish? There are all these sort of different gradations. And that's kind of how I lead the reader into it. So from the marketplace, then we go to a restaurant, and then from there, off spinning into this sort of salmon universe. But I wanted to start at the most basic level.
Do they still throw the fish at Pike?
Oh yeah, that's part of the attraction.
I just find that disrespectful to the food.
Well, PETA does too. I know that they have they've raised some objections about the throwing of the fish, but I don't know. I guess they hit on a formula that works for the tourists, and people seem to love it. Yeah, I know what you mean. Throwing a fish around doesn't seem very respectful.
Yeah, you're not going to throw steaks around and other food. It's just like I try to teach my daughter about respecting food. She also asks, why do we have to eat everything from scratch? I mean, we like her to know where her food comes from and to respect it, and the idea of wasting food and how much work it took to get on the plate. I think for her to see, because we don't eat fish in the house. My wife doesn't want to eat it because she thinks, I don't know why she doesn't cook it. She can cook it. As long as she doesn't cook with cilantro in the house, I'm fine. I can't stand the smell. But we like to know where our daughter needs to know where the food comes from. And I don't keep my fish, and there's no fish in the house, so maybe I'll harvest some white perch this weekend when my father-in-law comes to town, and he can teach her how to clean a fish.
Well, it's kind of similar in our household because my 13-year-old daughter is vegan, and so she is always trying to sort of teach us about animal cruelty and all of that, and some of it's catching on, I have to say. And I eat quite a few of the dishes that she prepares. We have a lot of tofu in our house as a result, and I happen to love tofu because I really like Sichuan Chinese cuisine, and I do a lot
firm tofu.
Yeah, I do a lot of Sichuan cooking, and so I'll make my daughter like yusheng eggplant, for instance, and she loves that, and she's teaching me how to make things with tofu, and I don't know, times are changing, right?
I had in Philadelphia at the Reading Market, Reading Terminal, I had vegetarian tuna salad made with chickpeas from a can, and you would never know. And I go through like 2 cans of that a week now, of chickpeas with mayonnaise, pickles, capers, dill.
I had chickpea stew for lunch, which my daughter had made. So we are loaded with cans of chickpeas here at our place, with the vegan diet. And, I would love it if maybe my daughter just every now and then would be able to taste some of my smoked salmon. But I also understand she's committed. And she does this because she loves animals. That's why she's vegan. And I cannot fault that. I love animals too. I might be a little more compromised, but I respect her commitment. And I think that she is emblematic of a whole new generation coming up right now that is seeing things differently. And I have a lot of hope for this generation. And I hope that they will make some of the changes that we need to have, especially when it comes to the environment. And don't even get me started about Scott Pruitt and the EPA. I mean,
yeah. Those guys are going to, that's right down the street.
These are dark times that we live in, but what's the expression that it's always darkest just before the dawn? Yeah. So, I do have hope for this generation that's coming up. And I mean, the same thing, I have a 17-year-old son. And
they can vote at the next election.
Exactly. Well, and he's an October birthday, so he will be.
Right on.
Yeah. And we need every vote that we can get. But he loves to fish. And I taught him. He had a Snoopy rod from the age of 2 and caught his first steelhead at the age of 3 on that Snoopy rod. I write about that in a piece that you can find. It was published in Gray's Sporting Journal years ago, but it's not in any of my books. But I read it recently in Seattle, and it was filmed and put on the Patagonia website. So you can go check that out if you want. But it's one of my favorite pieces, and I had never read it before because, frankly, I didn't think I could get through it without crying. And so I warned the audience ahead of time. I said, listen, I might be choking up here. Don't feel embarrassed for me, but I'm just giving you warning. But I got through it, but it's all about taking my son steelhead fishing when we lived off the grid in the Rogue River Canyon all those years ago.
Is he going to go back since they're too young? They don't remember it.
He barely remembers it. He was 3 and turned 4 while we were there. And he has some faint memories of it. He has since been back. We try to get back every couple of years. We actually went back last year for Labor Day weekend. And I don't know if you remember, but the West was on fire around that time of year last year. And there was a huge fire out on the Oregon coast that just blew all this smoke into the canyon. And we went in for one night, and I think we got up at we pulled in at maybe 8 o'clock at night. And by 4 in the morning, I'm waking up my wife and saying, we need to get out of here. Could barely breathe, and just hightailed it out with the kids. And so that was that. But we will get back there. It's an amazing place, and it's where I learned to steelhead fish. You were asking me earlier about mentors, and the people who own that homestead and who are part of this writing residency, the Boyden family. Bradley Boyden really became a good friend of mine and would become my steelhead mentor. And I write about him in the chapter on the Kispiox, fishing for steelhead up on the Kispiox, which is a tributary of the Skeena. And he was the one who first showed me how to sort of snake a little red ant pattern along the kind of basalt, bedrock of the Rogue River Canyon there, and get these. They call them half pounders. They're juvenile steelhead that return to the river after being. They head out to sea and spend, like less than a year in the salt, and then they return to the river, which is unusual, as juveniles. And then they go back out to sea again to finish their maturation in the salt. But while they're in the river as sort of juvenile steelhead, and they're trout-sized, they are really aggressive to the fly and super fun. And, they're sort of like 14 to 18 inches, something like that. And but really aggressive to the fly. And took my son down there with his Scooby-Doo rod, and he was 3 years old. And, he saw me throwing the fly and demanded that he use a fly as well. And I tried to explain that, when you're fishing with a lure, you can't really use a fly because you need a heavier line, right? So he got kind of upset at that idea. So what I ended up doing was tying on a little, 10-inch piece of monofilament to his rooster tail, and then to that I tied on an egg-sucking leech, and that just made him so excited. And so we're fishing for half-pounders there on the Rogue, and mixed in with the half-pounders, of course, are the adult fish that are returning to the river to spawn. And he hooked into one of those. And they're not super big on the Rogue, but, 5-6 pounds. And on a Scooby-Doo rod, let me tell you, he had some fun with that.
And at his age, he's already checked off some impressive waters he's fished.
He has, and he's fished with me in the salt. And he's caught silvers and pinks in the salt, and he's fished some of the warm water areas as well. He's fished down in Florida with a fly and caught ladyfish and sea trout and even snook. So yeah, he's
more accomplished than I am.
Well, we were just down that way for spring break last week, and I mentioned to you that I hooked into my first tarpon, and boy, that was just crazy. Have you ever fished for tarpon?
I have fished for them. I've only hooked one.
I mean, this thing jumped out of the water, and we were not expecting to hook a tarpon in this spot, and it scared me. I could feel my knees buckle a little bit. That's a big fish, And then Riley actually tied into a shark, which was pretty exciting. That thing just went. But yeah, we've managed to do a little bit of fishing here and there. I'm hoping that as I get a little older and try and start focusing on having a little more fun, that I'll be able to go to some of those. I've never bone fished, for instance.
That's fun. I haven't landed one of those either.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Your son is more accomplished than I am. I have never landed a snook.
They were fun. They weren't super big. They were kind of in the 18 to 22 inch category, and on the fly, it was awesome, yeah, we've had some fun father-son fishing trips. I took him to the Big Hole, and so he's experienced, fishing for large browns with very small trico patterns, which when he was 15 years old. So I've tried to expose him to some good action.
Nice. Let's see. Would you want to come on again and talk about urban fishing another time?
I know.
Got free time?
I know. We've kind of, where's the time gone? It's like we've been at it for an hour and 15 minutes, and we never even got into the urban fishery.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we could do it like a part 2.
Yeah, that sounds fun to me.
Okay. I hope there was some good usable stuff here for you.
Yeah. Hopefully everyone's encouraged to go buy your book on your old employer's site or their local bookstore. What about you? You got some lectures coming up soon. If people are listening to this in a timely fashion, where can people go and hear you talk?
Let me think about this for a second. I have been doing a lot of lectures recently. In terms of upcoming stuff, I'm doing, people can go to my website, and I have some links there that will take you to, appearances that I'm making. I've got some public library appearances coming up around the Seattle area, the sort of greater Seattle area, Washington. I do a lot of speaking engagements, up and down sort of the Washington, Oregon coast, down into California sometimes. I do different lectures. I'll talk about my books, but I also do a lot of wild food lectures. I call them my patch to plate lectures, where, maybe I'll give a talk on fall wild mushrooms, or, summer berries or something like that. And I show the different species in their habitats and then in finished dishes that I've created with them. And people seem to like those because it gives you some, ideas about how to take some of these foods, which, can sometimes be intimidating. You get your hands on some morels, for instance. Well, you want to do justice to them, You ever go morel hunting out where you are?
I've never even gone after fungi. If I could find porcinis, I would be very happy. I make a lot of porcini risotto.
I love porcini, and I do all sorts of things with porcini. And there's so much fun to find. And of course, morels. There's, morel hunters all over the country. I think they grow in just about every state. So I'll do these kind of patch to plate slideshows and talk about different types of wild foods. People seem to enjoy those.
When you were writing the fungi book, and you're bringing, I guess, fungus home all the time, was it like Forrest Gump with the shrimp?
Huge quantities. And so finally, for Father's Day a couple of years ago, my wife gave me what she calls the forager's fridge, because she was so tired of coming home and seeing the entire fridge in the kitchen just filled with bags of my wild foods that I'd been harvesting. So for Father's Day, I get the forager's fridge, which I can keep in the basement, and keep all my stuff in there. I mean, in season, if it's mushroom season, there's going to be a lot of mushrooms in the fridge. If it's berry season, same thing. And then I always have lots of fish in the freezer. I've got a vacuum sealer. And so right now, there's a bunch of salmon from Alaska. There's a little bit of halibut. There's probably some gooey duck clam in there. Definitely a lot of packs of mushrooms, which they freeze quite well. You have to saute them first, and then you vacuum seal them. And huckleberries, blackberries, I don't know, stinging nettle pesto. I've got all kinds of stuff in I have a dedicated stand-up freezer.
That's
for
fantastic.
All this stuff. Yeah. And then I dehydrate a lot of foods as well. So we've got mason jars filled with stuff. Yeah, it's fun.
I would love to take all those berries and make a syrup and infuse a vodka with them.
So I do that kind of stuff. I make I've done it with blackberries. What else have I done it with? Do you know what elderflower is? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like Saint Germain, if you've ever had Saint Germain. So I'll harvest a lot of elderflower in the spring. In fact, that's coming up. Usually I think I do that in May. And then I'll make, cordials, and I'll can them, and they last, a good long time. And they're great with like a splash of champagne or vodka or whatever. And I'll do that also with elderberry. Have you ever had elderberry syrup?
My wife probably has somehow put that in a cocktail. She's the cocktail maker in the house.
Yeah, if you're a mixologist, these wild foods are incredible.
And I want to get the Drunken Botanist book.
Yeah, that's supposed to be awesome. Somebody was telling me about the latest craze in infusing. I'm trying to remember. A friend of mine who is married to a Russian woman. And the Russians, Eastern Europeans
that is
are
my
crazy.
wife. My wife is from Mazarasha.
Oh, well, there you go. And
so my in-laws are coming. I got beets, potatoes, onions, leeks,
but
vodka,
what about
and bread.
They are crazy about wild mushrooms.
That's all my father does in Colorado. Is his freezer's like yours. It's pickled mushrooms and rainbow trout.
I bet he's going after porcini, right, after the monsoons.
It's hard to understand him. He's so Russian.
Oh, really? Well, one of the things that these friends of mine make is they take vodka and they infuse it with yellowfoot chanterelles. And it's really, really good. And all the chanterelles and their cousins, yellowfoot, black trumpets, they're all kind of members of the chanterelle family. They have a kind of a fruitiness, which is sort of interesting for wild mushrooms. Some, like chefs, will say that they're reminiscent of stone fruits like apricots. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of sweetness there. And I got to say, the vodka infused with yellowfoot chanterelle is just amazing. The other thing that your wife probably would be into is there's a type of mushroom called Lactarius, which is a gilled mushroom. And when you bruise it or you cut it, it kind of extrudes a sort of a milky, like latexy like substance.
The name lactation.
Yeah, so that's why the genus is called Lactarius, and the Russians love those. But here in this country, most recreational mushroom harvesters don't really pay any attention to them. But they're really good. And again, my Russian friends will they'll pack them in salt with lemon zest, and that's how they preserve them. And they are amazing.
I might have to take my father-in-law out this weekend. Besides getting white perch, need to look for some fungi.
So wait, is your wife, does she have any experience mushroom hunting, or does she have family lore about mushroom hunting? Because in Russia, it's just huge.
Yeah, they didn't have anything to eat back in the day, so they had to go look for it.
Yeah, I've been told that there's a train that goes out of Moscow, and on weekends it just fills up with people with their baskets, and it heads out into the woods, and people just get off at whatever stop and go to their patches, and then at the end of the day, everybody gets back on the train when it's going the other way, and they've got full baskets, and they're heading back to the city. It sounds
I'll
great.
ask them about that.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law makes ridiculous latkes because potatoes and onions were one of the few things you could have back in the day.
Yeah,
you could find food.
So my wife is Polish-Italian. And so we have some interesting food ways in our house as well. So with the Polish side, definitely, she's making, similar type things.
Pierogies.
She's making pierogies and haluski, you know what that is. And, and then there's the Italian side of the family. And of course the porcini is very important for that. We do a lot of different pastas, and mushrooms are they're filled with umami. And here's the other thing, 10 years ago, it would have seemed a little bit capricious to kind of marry seafood with wild mushrooms, but in fact, they pair together really well because they're both loaded with umami, and so even shellfish with wild mushrooms. So I do for instance, I'll do a spring Chinook with morels and a red wine reduction or something like that. Or
that?
Yeah, it's super good. That's right. That's how we'll get you back on the salmon diet. Yeah. And then diver scallops, pan seared with some morels and a little nettle sauce. Oh, that's good action. It's surprising, but fish and mushrooms go really well together. And, for vegetarians, like you were saying, your daughter, right? Does she eat mushrooms?
She used to eat porcini mushroom risotto with peas when she was in preschool for lunch.
Yeah.
Now she's getting a little more picky.
Okay. How old is she?
She'll be 7 in about 5 weeks.
Yeah, she and Ruby sound like they're really cut from the same cloth.
Yeah, she could live off. She loves her breakfast. For her is bagels with capers on it.
Uh-huh.
Everything bagel specifically.
Right.
But she'll sit there and just eat capers out of the jar. All right, as long as you're eating something that's not garbage.
Yeah. No, that's adventurous. Huh. Very cool. Yeah, well, we should definitely talk urban fishing at some point, because I would love to tell you about fishing for silvers and pinks right here in Seattle city limits, which is yesterday I was teaching a shellfish class out on Hood Canal, and I brought some of my smoked salmon for that class. And I love telling people that it's my Superfund site salmon because, in fact, if we're fishing the lower Duwamish River, which is Seattle's working river, it is a Superfund site. But, of course,
my dad wrote all that stuff. He used to work for EPA back in the day.
Oh, right. Exactly. Yeah. So you're probably familiar with that. And, I mean, that's where Boeing is. And, who knows what kind of nasty chemicals are just sitting on the bottom of the Duwamish. But and they've been cleaning it up for years. But the thing is the salmon, they're in the Superfund area for the time that it takes for the tide to change.
That's like the white perch here. They're in, and then they're gone. So all the fish in the river now, they're not contaminated with all the DC nasty. Right.
And they're spawning up, in the crystal clean waters upstream, and so, they pass through all the contaminants, but they're not really living it. Not the way a ground fish would. I mean, I would never eat a flounder out of there, But yeah, no, it's kind of fun to be able to fish, with the trash compactors and the Boeing jets that are taking off, the test planes. I can remember when they were developing the new model. I can't remember what it was called, but we'd see this huge thing come right over us. We'd be out there on in our pontoon boats, and I mean the pink salmon. And here I am. I'm kind of getting into it, but we maybe should save this for another time. But they really like a fly, and it can just be. I mean, they get kind of. Sometimes they'll be schooled up. And they just get kind of crazy. They just start slashing at flies left and right, and we'll all be out there in our pontoons, a whole bunch of us, and just everybody's hooking into fish, and it's so much fun.
That does sound fun. And my wife said those buildings are big enough that clouds will form inside of them. The Boeing buildings.
Really?
Yep.
I'm not surprised with where they're making the airplanes.
Yep.
Well, they're huge too. Yeah, they are massive.
Yeah, she's had to go tour them a couple times for her incognito work stuff she does.
Oh, right, DOD. Yes. Yeah.
She actually texted. She's on her way back from Auckland right now. She just got on the plane.
She probably has to keep pretty close tabs. Well, it was a Boeing engine that exploded on that Southwest flight.
That was horrific.
Yeah, that's really scary. I don't want to know what happened to that poor passenger who got sucked out. Yeah. That's not a good way to go. We should. Do you want to just continue the conversation another time?
Absolutely. In the meantime, where can we find you and your wife online?
So you can find me at langdoncook.com.
Proper name for somebody that does all the cooking.
There you go. Yeah. Although I didn't come to it right away. I had to learn. And it really wasn't until I met the woman who would become my wife that I started getting into gear on the cooking front. And I tell a funny little story about that in my book, Fat of the Land, because the first time I cooked for her, I was a grad student. I was probably in my early 20s. And I made her what I thought was a real delicacy, which was my home-cooked version of an Egg McMuffin. It's kind of embarrassing to tell that story, but I think, I had probably a 6-pack of beer in the fridge, a package of Hormel Canadian ham, and maybe a couple of eggs and some stale English muffins and some American cheese, otherwise bare fridge.
House.
Totally. And so that, and I think it might have been, the first morning that she woke up in my apartment and, oh, honey, let me make you a real treat. So I had to get she declined, by the way. She held the package of Canadian bacon with her thumb and forefinger, like holding up a stool sample or something. And just said, thanks, but I'm going to pass.
I'm going to go out to eat.
Yeah. So I realized at that point that, okay, maybe I need to learn how to cook. I couldn't even chop an onion back then. So it's been a process. But I like to remind people in my talks and lectures that if I can do this, anyone can. So, I mean, I'm an enthusiastic home cook, but by no means am I professionally trained. I've never worked in a restaurant. And so, this is just what I've learned to do at home. But it's been a fun journey. And then, of course, the foraging part of it has been in tandem. And so I've kind of, just been learning along the way both how to forage and how to cook. And it's been a great sort of tandem process.
Fantastic.
Hey, It's been fun talking to you.
Thanks for taking the time out. Hopefully everyone goes out and purchases your book or gets them from their local library. Purchasing's better.
Hey, I'm all for that.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law actually got the book out from the library, and she's still hearing about it to this day.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we'll be doing this again.
Maybe we should cut that last part. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't want to. No, you don't have to cut it. But I did. I mean, can you imagine if your mother-in-law got your book from the library instead of buying it?
Terrible.
So I still give my wife a lot of crap about that. But anyway, yeah. Do you want to talk urban fishing? Like, just I don't know. Whenever you want to, just let me know. Okay.
Maybe during the dog days of summer when things slow down.
Yeah, I mean, for us, that's sort of when it gets going is in the summer. July, August, September. That's when I'm either fishing the beaches around Seattle, or once the fish start piling into the rivers, late August, then we'll go and we'll fish the estuaries in the lower sections of the Duwamish, and that's super fun. You should come out.
Working on it.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Hey, great talking to you.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast. For more information or to contact Rob, please go to www.robsnowhite.com.
This has been a production of Freestone Media.